notable feature of the Southern's operations in the West Country at this time was the use of ancient tank locomotives on the Bodmin and Wadebridge Railway. We saw the Beatty well tanks in the early grouping period in the first part of this series, and apart from the provision of Drummond chimneys and boilers, they have hardly changed as we see them once again 30 years later. Not only the locomotives, but working methods have hardly changed. Indeed, they've hardly changed since the last century. Herein lay one of British Railway's major problems, as the erosion of traffic by road transport meant that the economics of railway operation were undermined. Labour-intensive working practices meant that it cost nearly as much to move one wagon as a whole train. The traditional railway was labour-intensive in many ways. Signalling methods had been perfected in the 19th century, but they needed frequent signal boxes, each with 24-hour manning where the railway was continuously open. Some lines, like the Somerset and Dorset seen here, operated two-shift working for some of the time, closing down in the night hours. Even methods of speeding up the traffic flow, such as the use of the Whitaker token apparatus, which allowed trains on the single line to exchange the possession tokens at speed, were still very labour-intensive. Not only that, they also required a considerable amount of hardware, which needed frequent maintenance. The track itself was unchanged in essentials since the early days, all head rails having to be inspected at regular intervals in case the keys had fallen out. Signals had many working parts. Lamps needed to be lit and refueled. Locomotives and wagons needed to be oiled every day, as well as manned. Wagon brakes had to be operated by hand in most cases. All these factors were acceptable whilst labour was cheap and willing to put up with the harsh conditions. But in the "you've never had it so good" 1950s, the new generation was promised better conditions, and were able to find them. So the railways found it difficult to recruit new staff. This train is emerging from Coombe Down Tunnel near Bath, with an LMS 2P piloting a Black 5. This tunnel was of extremely restricted bore, and was on a severe upward gradient, so both locomotives had to work flat out. The conditions on the exposed footplate can only be imagined. Only dedicated railwaymen would accept the risk to their health. The Somerset and Dorset was home to many of the small Midland-inspired 060s and 440s, which had been adopted as standard by the LMS,